Greetings. I'm Steve Courtney. I'm a hanger-on at the Mark Twain House after having worked there for about a decade, and I'm lucky to be here tonight with an extraordinary gathering of three scholars who knew Hal Holbrook well. But first, we're what we call the housekeeping. The very first announcement was that Peter Roos, the director of the Mark Twain House, was planning to be here tonight, but he's getting over his second shot. We all know what that means. And we will not see him, but he sends his greetings to all concerned. And all concerned, as you may see down in that turquoise line below, are the Center for Mark Twain Studies in Elmira, New York, the Mark Twain Papers and Project in Berkeley, California, the Mark Twain Boyhood Home and Museum in Hannibal, Missouri, and the Mark Twain House and Museum here in Hartford, Connecticut. And let me bring you back to that turquoise line for a moment, because that is where you can click and put in the price of admission, whatever you'd like. It's anything from $500 to I won't mention the upper figure, but that's something you can do. And one more thing, our sterling director of public programs, Jennifer LaRue, will be monitoring your questions. Now, don't ask your question in that chat area over to the side. Ask your question by going under the turquoise line where it says in rather small print, ask a question. So that's how to do that. I've also been asked to say that the Mark Twain House, after having been closed for a considerable amount of time, is now reopened for weekend visits, and you can go to their website and read all about that, marktwainhouse.org. But now to Hal Holbrook. I don't think very many of you probably need an explanation of Hal Holbrook and his influence and impact, his passion for Mark Twain, his unusual combination of wild humor, subtle humor, and a rigorous social conscience. If you caught the presentation of the documentary Holbrook Twain, An American Odyssey last week, and Cindy Lovell's discussion with director Scott Teems and producer Laura Smith, you got a wonderful taste of Hal's story. The film, in fact, is still available. You can purchase it tonight over in the chat. There will be a link. You can see a link to a way to get it. But back to his social conscience. It lit up the late 19th century, an energetic but also a dark time for our republic. It is due to Hal and his nearly 60-year stage portrayal of Twain that we of the 20th and 21st century got to feel a link with the Lincoln of our literature, as Twain's friend William Dean Howells called him. Hal, of course, was not just Mark Twain. His many years as an actor included dozens of roles, such as Abraham Lincoln in a TV miniseries, Deep Throat in the film All the President's Men, King Lear, and dozens of others. You can read much more in the many long and detailed obituaries that appeared after his death on January 23rd. But we're here with a rare group of scholars who can provide intimate and varied accounts of their relationships with Hal and eloquent words about the significance of his work for our time and indeed for any times. I once read a passage from Twain aloud to an audience at an elegant shop on Rodeo Drive in Beverly Hills. I was doing my best, not trying to reproduce the famous drawl, but trying to pace the thing, to use pauses the way Twain described in his essay, How to Tell a Story, to catch the pacing and the rhythm and what he called the nub, the point, the snapper. I was feeling quite proud of myself. Then the door of the shop opened and local resident Hal Holbrook walked in. I felt like I could sink into the floor and disappear. I feel a little like that tonight with the three luminaries here with me. Each has an impressive resume. Each has his or her own perspective on this rare performer and human being. They are, starting with Mark Dawidziak, 43 years at the Cleveland Plain Dealer, much of that time as a television critic, and as he's told me, many other kinds of critics. He is also an author, playwright, director, and actor. He actually performs as Mark Twain himself in live performances. And he's a scholar with books including Mark My Words, Mark Twain on Writing, and Horton Foote's The Shape of the River, the lost teleplay about Mark Twain. And other books provide commentary on aspects of popular culture. Columbo, The Twilight Zone, Stephen King, and many more. And he is currently working on a biography of Edgar Allan Poe. Then to Shelley Fisher Fishkin, the Joseph S. Atha Professor of Humanities, Professor of English, and Director of American Studies at Stanford University. Her principal concern during her career has been literature and social justice. She is the author, award-winning author, editor, and co-editor of 48 books, over 100 articles, essays, columns, and reviews, and she's responsible for the magisterial 29-volume Oxford Mark Twain, which she edited. And her books of literary criticism was Hot Black, Mark Twain and African American Voices, Lighting Out for the Territory, Mark Twain's Book of Animals, and the Mark Twain Anthology, Great Writers on His Life and Work. She's currently working on a book called Citizen Twain, Mark Twain and Hal Holbrook on Racism, Jingoism, and Corruption. And then to Cindy Lovell, last but not least, has held tenured positions at Stetson and Quincy universities. She's the only person to have served as executive director of both the Mark Twain Boyhood Home and Museum in Hannibal, Missouri, and the Mark Twain House and Museum in Hartford, Connecticut. She created and co-produced Mark Twain Words and Music, a CD featuring Jimmy Buffett, Clint Eastwood, Brad Paisley, and others as a benefit for the Boyhood Home. She booked Hal twice to perform in Hannibal and brought him to Hartford to perform on his 90th birthday. She's written extensively on Twainian subjects, now follows her passion as an educator in Florida. On a personal note, our conversations over lunch at the Corner Pug in Hartford during her tenure are a memorable part of my own experience here. So I'd like to ask each of you to tell us something about your relationship with Hal, and we agreed to work alphabetically from Mark to Shelley to Cindy. Then we'll go back and we'll talk about the significance of his long and worthy career. And if some of these categories of significance and reminiscence blur into each other, that will be fine here. This will lead, I hope, to what Mark Twain's friend Joseph Twitchell always called a full, fine feast of talk, which is what they had as they walked together in the Hartford area, in the Alps, and anywhere else. So, and then, as I said, if you have something to ask, tap that question button below and ask it. So we'll start with Mark. With Mark, in the reminiscence category, where did you meet Hal Holbrook?
Well, I first encountered Hal in 1967 when he did the one-man show for CBS. He did not know we were being encountered because I was on one side of a TV screen and he was on the other. And I was about 9 years old, 10 years old, I think. And what difference does it make? I'm doing a Twain moment here. But I was just mesmerized. A lot of it went over my head at 10 years old, but there was Mark Twain, and it was Mark Twain as far as I was concerned. It was such a complete transformation that it just fired me up about Mark Twain at that young age. And then when I was in college at George Washington University, he brought it to the Kennedy Center in 1975, and I saw it live. And if watching Mark Twain tonight on TV ignited a spark of interest in Mark Twain, then seeing that show in 1975 brushed that spark into a prairie fire. Because after that, I became obsessed about Mark Twain and studying Mark Twain. And, I always wanted to get an opportunity to let Hal Holbrook know that he was largely responsible for this. And in 1980, it was about 35 years ago, I was at a network. I was a TV critic at the time at the Akron Beacon Journal. And I was at a network press party. And I walked into the room, and Hal was standing in a very quiet corner of the ballroom being interviewed by another reporter. And in journalistic terms, I worked my way into the on-deck position, which is standing right next, meaning I'm next. I get the next interview. So I waited until they were done. The other reporter walked away. I walked up, and I managed to be coherent. I think the most amazing thing about that evening was that I managed not to make a babbling fool of myself and falling all over myself at this moment of meeting him. And we very quickly bonded. And of course, we bonded over Mark Twain. And where two or more are gathered, we've all had this experience of talking about Mark Twain. You can get yourself pretty worked up. And that's what we did. It was sort of like, can you believe this guy? He just keeps coming, doesn't he? He just never ceases to surprise you. He just ceases to amaze you. And we are getting just more and more just intensified, like two true believers will when they're in the same place at the same time. And I'm telling him just how much this has meant to me and how much is this. And all of a sudden he grew quiet. He grew really, really quiet. And he had a drink in his hand. He looked down at the drink. And he looked up at me under an arched eyebrow, which was an expression I'd get to know very well over the years. And he said very quietly, "You do understand, I don't think I'm Mark Twain, don't you?" Because we had been getting so worked up. And I said to me, I said, of course, because I've acted enough to know that once you get lost in the part, what actors call getting lost in the part, once you lose yourself, you can never play the part. Once you think you're Lincoln, you can't play Lincoln. And I immediately started to say, I admire Hal Holbrook, not just because he's Mark Twain, and I start to rattle off his other credits that he did. And you could just see him getting, you get it. You really, really get it, don't you? And that was the start. And that was the start of it's the end of Casablanca. It was Louis, this is the start of a beautiful friendship.
Now, on to Shelley, I guess.
Well, I got a remarkable postcard out of the blue in March of 1985 from Hal Holbrook. He said he was playing Lincoln and he came across an article about my research in the New York Times and he wanted to meet me. So sometime when he's playing in a city that I'm in, let's get together. And this was very exciting. The article was about research that confirmed that Twain was opposed to racism and the legacies of slavery the year that he published Huck Finn. And Hal wrote, he said, I'm not at all surprised by this. I'd really like to chat with you. It took a couple of years, but then because I was in the process of moving to Austin, Texas, and he was coming to Austin, Texas to do a show, and my husband and I arranged to go out to dinner with him and his manager, and we had one of those wonderful, wide-ranging conversations that Mark was just alluding to, and we were so engaged and so intensely involved in what we were talking about that we were oblivious to anything happening outside. What was happening outside was Austin was becoming a solid sheet of ice. There was an ice storm that was unprecedented. The entire city had frozen. And when we went downstairs to try to take him back to his hotel, the car skidded, so we realized we couldn't get out of the parking space. It took 2 hours to walk 2 blocks on the ice to his hotel. My husband and I had to call the babysitter, tell her to stay over. We had to check into the hotel. Needless to say, it was a memorable evening. But the memorable part of it was meeting Hal. And that was the beginning of a 30-year friendship that has been such a privilege and such a joy, and really one of the greatest pleasures of my life. For the last couple of years, since the middle of 2017, I've been fortunate enough to be able to go visit him about once every 8 weeks or so and spend a couple of days talking to him, going through his journals, going through his archives, immersing myself in the history of his Twain show. And it was just so special. And so remarkable, and Joyce Cohn, his fabulous devoted assistant if you're there, Joyce. Thank you for having made my visits possible, but for having made Hal possible. I mean, he was really so grateful to all that you did that enabled him to be who he was. I was totally astonished over and over again at what an incredible Twain scholar he was. He's really the best Twain scholar out there, having inhabited this man's voice and soul and heart for all these years. He just knew stuff that none of us mere mortals could know. And I remember when I was going through the archives, I came across a letter, an exchange that we'd had of letters 20 years ago in which he disagreed with something I'd said about Twain. And I decided now he was absolutely right. I was totally wrong. He had Twain's number. He had a beat on this issue long before the rest of us did. So I have to say he was my ideal reader. Every writer needs to write for an ideal reader. Everything I wrote for him, and it was such a joy that he read everything I wrote about Twain, and he told me what he thought about it, and it was really a special part of being a scholar. You know, you can't. Writing about a 19th century person, you can't meet that person, but this was as close as I could come to ever meeting Mark Twain.
Lovely. Cindy, chime in.
Oh my goodness. I love hearing the origin stories of how Mark and Shelley came in contact with Hal, and of course all the years of friendship thereafter. And it's been like that with other people. You know, everybody I talk to when it comes to Hal Holbrook, everybody tells me the first time I saw Hal, the first place I saw Hal. It's been fun. I've been watching the comments of people saying their first encounter with Hal, whether it was an encounter. Mark, you were lucky. I didn't have a TV growing up. My parents were anti-TV. So, you know, I knew Mark Twain because of reading Mark Twain as a kid, but it took me a long time to find out there was a guy out there doing what Hal did. And of course, I had no concept of what it really was. I bought the record albums. I have the vinyl albums, and I played them over and over and over. And I love those albums. And just never, he was never in my vicinity, or was never, you know, it never came on my radar until 1996 when I was a graduate student at the University of Iowa. And, you know, I told the story to Scott and Laura, and they put it in the documentary. And of all the things I talked about with Hal, that was the one they zeroed in on. It was the odd way that I met him. It was, I moved from Florida to Iowa. I knew that winter was going to be cold, so I went out and bought some boots at Walmart for a whopping $35, and didn't think anything about that until somebody said, "Hey, you know, Hal Holbrook is going to be in Burlington, Iowa." I said, "Where's Burlington?" And it turned out it wasn't that far from Iowa City. So I looked into it. I called down there. The tickets were $35. I was on the typical graduate student budget, meaning you just didn't squander $35 here or there. But this would be the first time to get to see him perform Hal Holbrook live. And I had only ever heard him do it on the records. So I thought about how to best make this happen. And of course, I did what anybody would have done. I took the boots back to Walmart and got my $35 to buy the ticket. And I did go to that performance. And everybody watching this, I'm assuming, has seen Hal perform. So you know what I'm going to say. You know that you were in the room with Mark Twain. It's like Shelley said, he embodied his heart and soul. And you were in the room with Mark Twain. So Hal wasn't really on my radar. It was Mark Twain on my radar. So watching him do this and bring him to life, I was crying. Parts I would laugh. I was, you know, of course, resisting the urge to finish some of the lines because they were familiar to me. And I was kind of high, I guess, kind of buzzed by it all. I would, you know, and I had asked my son in Florida to mail the album covers to me. I thought maybe I can get him to sign these. And sure enough, I got to go backstage and have my turn and meet him. And he was so kind and so gracious. As if you've ever met him, you know, that's how he would always be. He was always thoughtful and kind to everybody. I especially loved the way he interacted with children after his performances. I took many children to see Hal, and that always was gratifying to watch that. But he just was open and kind and sweet, and understood my tears and my I said, I've waited my whole life to meet you. And he kind of looked at me, and it's like Mark said with the eyebrow, he kind of looked at me and he said, not Hal Holbrook. And I admitted I was in a daze. I said, no, Mark Twain. He knew that and I think other people must have said that to him down through the years. So later, of course, we did become friends, and I last saw him in 2019 at his home in Beverly Hills, and in between those years, very blessed to have had this beautiful friendship with him. Miss him terribly, really miss him.
Well, we had agreed that then now we'll go back the other way, starting with you, Cindy, and talk about his significance, his work, and what sort of that meant for the world or for America or whatever you'd like to talk about. And what you've all said has sparked questions which I would love to get answered afterwards. So there's just, we'll devolve into a conversation eventually.
Sure.
But Cindy, his work, his significance.
It's hard to talk about him without tearing up. So I apologize in advance. Shelley nailed it. Nobody can fill the shoes. Nobody's done what he's done. He was the consummate Twain scholar. I never knew anybody who dug so deeply and went to so many different sources. And he was so accessible to other Twain scholars or people interested in Twain. But I think from my perspective, and I know Shelley's is much different as is Mark, I got to present Hal 3 times. I booked him to Hannibal twice. I booked him to Hartford on his 90th birthday. I went to 20 different performances in the span of years that I knew him, and 13 different states. And my read on Hal's significance, and I know that from a scholarly viewpoint, it's incomparable, but from the audience perspective, from the perspective of his impact on preserving Mark Twain's legacy, I think he just outdid everybody. I would go to those performances and listen to the people around me whispering and chatting, gasping, breaking into tears. And then at intermission, I love to go out into the lobby and just listen. I didn't need to talk to anybody. I didn't need to have a Coke. I didn't need to do anything but just listen. And the speculation and the questions and people talking about, I have to look that up. I think I read that before. And giving him so much praise because he was bringing Mark Twain to life and he was saying all these things. Hal focused on what Mark Twain focused on, which of course was human nature. And you can read many things that Hal's written about that as far as, he said, Mark Twain said, everybody's crazy. If you want to know why, just read Mark Twain. But it was that human nature perspective. When he got up in the morning on the day of a show, he would, of course, read the paper and see the headlines. He knew what was happening, and he was very selective. He had a vast repertoire of memorized Twain material. How he packed all that in his head, I'll never comprehend. There'll never be anyone again in my lifetime who can do that. But he had all these different scenes that he could reenact. And whatever was happening in the news, that's how he would choose what to talk about, what to perform that night. And one of the performances that stands out in my mind was in New Hampshire, Concord, New Hampshire. And it was in 2014. I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget to say the year. 2014. It was April 11th. And that's significant because it was just coming up on the 1-year anniversary to the Boston Marathon bombing. And everybody was feeling this in a real tangible way. And Hal had chosen a piece to do that night, knowing that this was on everyone's mind and knowing the New England community. Of course, his roots were in New England, and everybody felt this. That might have happened in Boston, but here in New Hampshire, they were feeling it too. And he brought out a piece about violence and gun violence and delivered it in such a way that entire audience, Mallory Howard was there with me, and she'll back me up and remember this, that entire audience inhaled at the same moment, and you could hear the people choking in sobs as he delivered that. But that was the beauty of him. He knew Mark Twain so well. He had so much at his fingertips that whatever was in the news, whatever was relevant, he could speak to it through Mark Twain.
Yeah.
Politics, religion, all of it. He had it. It was so accessible to him.
Yeah. Well, something he makes clear in the film is that he believes an actor's job is to make the audience think. And he describes so well this. They describe well in the film his going to Oxford, Mississippi, in the middle of the Ole Miss business back in 1962, and just hearing the silence to him was important. That people were not cursing and clapping, and they were silent because they were thinking. The things were going in their minds.
Yeah.
But I didn't mean to interrupt. Well,
oh, no. He was a master actor. Someone on last week's session made the comment, don't forget that Hal was a great actor. And Mark talked about that, about all the other roles that he was so famous for and that he delivered so convincingly. And he because he was this great actor and loved working with the live audience, he would read that audience, and he knew, how to play and interact and bring them, right to that point. Well, I watched him do it in Nashville one night where he just had everybody squirming and so uncomfortable. And I was with a lot of people that night. And I remember kind of looking to my left and right, and and you could just see that people were holding their breath. And then he released them. He made them laugh, just like Mark Twain. But he knew Twain so well, he could do that. So, I wonder what Mark and Shelley have to say. I'll talk all night.
Yeah. No, that's fine. Shelley.
Well, I think, we are so blessed that Hal Holbrook found Mark Twain and Mark Twain found Hal Holbrook, because no other writer has had such a kindred spirit take charge, really, of his legacy for another several generations. He allowed Twain to speak to 20th century and 21st century audiences with humor and wit, to be sure, but also with dazzling eloquence and power. And what he did was blend Twain's celebrated platform gifts with another dimension of Twain, with the kind of biting satiric pieces Twain wrote in his later years and left unpublished at his death. Twain himself could not present that material to the public, but Hal did. And by combining the familiar Twain with this less familiar Twain, he really brought Twain into our time as a brilliant social critic. He prevented him from being pigeonholed as a cracker barrel funny man, and allowed the serious and profound side of him to make an impact on the 20th and 21st century. And your comment about his from the film about his saying that what was most important was getting people to think, that this is what he believed was central to Twain. I asked him once what he learned from Mark Twain, and he said to doubt, to ask questions. And that's what he wanted us to learn how to do. And he would shape the show in a way that would get the audience to ask questions. Now, Mark Twain, in his day, was able to expose the bad faith and hypocrisy of white Americans' treatment of the Chinese in the 1860s and 70s, and of African Americans in the 19th century and beyond, and also to lay bare the greed and corruption of the Gilded Age. Well, Hal was able to expose the lies and shams and the brazen silencings of the McCarthy era. That's what initially got him into Twain. Twain was his way of dealing with the silencings of the McCarthy era. It also allowed him to help Americans deal with the lies of the Vietnam War in the 60s and 70s. And then with Americans' refusal throughout the last century, and this one to deal with the rampant racism in society. And then decades after he began his show, it empowered him to deftly take on the deceptions and the ignorance and the unadulterated egotism of Donald Trump. And in fact, when I saw him perform in 2017 in Denver, just about 6 weeks after Trump took office, people were shocked. He actually got heckled. People thought he was making it up and talking about Trump. He referred to the president, and it was Roosevelt. and he was doing riffs that related to Roosevelt's arrogance and egotism. But they were so apt that I talked to one man leaving at intermission, and I think he may have been the man who heckled him. Someone heckled him and said, "Where's Mark Twain?" They were sure that it was just Holbrook we were getting, not Twain. And this man said, "Well, I'm leaving because he was just saying too much that wasn't Twain." It was always Twain. I told him it was Twain. He said, "Well, I don't believe you." But he had the uncanny ability to pull in material that was so apt that audiences could not believe that Twain wasn't reading our minds, wasn't reading our paper. Hal once said that when I read the morning paper, if I didn't have Mark Twain as a vehicle to comment on it, I'd go nuts. That Twain was his way of dealing with all of the insanities, all the absurdities of our world. And he dealt with it through humor and satire, but also through a lot more. And he recognized that the humor and the laughter were not unrelated to the getting people to think. He knew that getting people to laugh can loosen their minds, can get them to look at things from a different perspective, and also can be like a Trojan horse that gets past the sentries that people post to defend themselves against things that are going to challenge their worldview or their prejudices. Well, he would use humor to get past the sentries, and then he would explode some extraordinary bits of power and munition that would just really blast through whatever our complacency was and get us to look again at ourselves, be more honest with ourselves.
Yeah, against the assault of laughter, nothing can stand, as Mark Twain said. I hope I got the quote right, Cindy. So on to you, Mark. Significance.
Well, I'll pick up right where Shelley just left off, because Hal once said that to me, where he said, I really do think I'd go crazy if I didn't have this show to do. I get so angry every morning when I read about the imbecilities, extravagances of the human race, that if I didn't have this show to go out and do, I would literally go nuts. And I think that was true. I think the show was very cathartic for Hal, but it was very cathartic for us, because the important thing about, try to put this in perspective, and it's hard to put this in perspective because Hal's accomplishment is so big. It's so huge that trying to get a perspective of it is really tough. You have to stand back a little bit and just see how tall this guy stood. Hal was tall in real life, but he really stood tall on that stage. And one of the great things about this accomplishment, to try to put this into some kind of perspective, it has often been said by me that you could go back to the Greeks and not find the equivalent of what Hal did as a theatrical accomplishment. Living with one role for 63 years. Let me repeat that. 63 years in an ever-changing show that reflected the American character at the moment, reflected back to us who we were. That's an amazing accomplishment. He didn't just live with one character in one piece. People would say to me, they say, well, how many times did you see him? Like Cindy said, she saw it 20 times there in a span. And I lost track of how many times I saw it. And somebody once said to me, how can you see the same show over and over again? I said, because it's not the same show over and over again. It's a different experience every single time. Hal lost track about how many hours he had committed to memory. I think it came up to about 18 hours myself that he had over the years committed to memory. So he had on his hard drive an amazing insight into Twain, which, as Cindy and Shelley both said, nobody else had it, because he knew Twain from the inside. And you can study Twain all you want, but you're never going to get that insight from studying in a dusty archive somewhere. He brought Twain to life. And the amazing thing about that show is that it's not just the 63-year run. I mean, imagine, if you start at 20 years old, you'd have to live to be 83 and be able to stand on your feet for 2 hours to keep doing this. It's just, to me, again, he was an actor's actor, That was true. Martin Sheen called him an actor's actor. He was, and you have to take all the accomplishments. But if the only thing that he ever did was Mark Twain Tonight, this still would be something of legendary accomplishment. And you cannot overstate that enough. Hal was always gracious. The word gracious has come up a lot. And one of the most gracious things that Hal ever did for me was to make me feel like a big shot every once in a while. And he would talk to me as if I were some close to equal. And there was no equal, because there's nobody will ever touch Hal Holbrook and what he did. And I often told him that he was the gold standard and nobody was ever going to get near him in what he did. But one of the things that he would ask, like, well, when you perform this, that's treating somebody like a big shot when he asked that. But I remember once talking to him about doing a piece on politics, about a 15-minute monologue, and I would always start with humor, and it would get progressively more serious. And you'd stop talking really about the politician, and you were talking about the American citizen and their role and their failure to live up to the American ideal. It's funny when you're talking about the politician. It's not so funny. And Hal taught me about the power of silences, because the audience would get awfully quiet. And when I told Hal that once, he said to me, chastened. The word you're looking for is chastened. They are sitting there chastened, and here's the secret. They'll take it from Mark Twain when they won't take it from anybody else. If you or I went out there and said the same thing, they'd tear us to pieces. But they'll take it from Mark Twain. And that, to me, and that's why it was important that for 63 years, Hal made people take it. And he did it, as Twain called himself, a moralist in disguise. He did it behind humor. But I don't think you can emphasize too much something that Shelley said. And I think she said it to me when I did a paper on Hal. And that is that Hal he amplified Mark Twain for us in the 1960s. He broadened our vision of who if you look at Mark Twain in 1960, he's still kind of the genial family author. He's still the humorist. He's kind of Will Rogers in a white suit going into the 1960s. And he's the view of Twain has not really changed since Twain died. It's for 50 years we've had the same view of Mark Twain. And now all of a sudden, here comes Hal Holbrook giving voice, as Shelley said, that Twain himself could not give. And he brought alive Mark Twain as a social critic. He brought Twain alive as this person who indicts the folly of human beings. And that's something that Twain himself could not do to a great extent in his lifetime. And that's one of the things that's so important about it. Like I said, we could be here, like Cindy said, we could be here all night talking about why this guy is important, not only to the American theater, not only as an actor, but to Twain's scholarship as well. Because nobody lit it up like Hal did in the 1960s. I'm working on this book on Poe, right? Poe and Twain are the two most recognizable American authors of the 1900s. Not even close. You show a picture of Edgar Allan Poe to people, they probably will recognize who he is. And if you show a picture of Mark Twain to people, they probably have a good shot at knowing who he is. Even if they've never read him, they have a good shot. But our view of Poe has never changed. He's still the guy who wrote The Telltale Heart. Our vision of Poe is in 1960s the same as it is now. We don't know really who the real Poe is. We know a lot more about who the real Mark Twain was, and Hal Holbrook has a lot to do with that.
Yeah, in reflection, a reflection on what all of you said, really. I had a situation, sort of what Cindy described, of absolute surprise and being gobsmacked, to use a wonderful word, around the time of the 2008 financial crisis. And I heard this from Hal Holbrook: great republics do not last, vast wealth and power corrupt. He goes on to say, this has been a strange panic. You remember that panic means depression in 19th century language. This has been a strange panic. It's like a blight, a paralysis, in which a mighty machine has slipped its belt and is still running and accomplishing nothing. a creepy and awful stillness has given us an atmosphere of apprehension. The phrase layoff has become common. And he goes on and you suddenly think he's writing about 2008 or 2010, whenever he said this. A blight has fallen upon us, and the monarchy of the rich and the powerful is the author of it. And I was interested enough in this to ask Joyce Cohen, his wonderful assistant that has been mentioned, where did that come from? And turns out it's from one of the autobiographical dictations, and the wording is not the same. I mean, at the end he says the monarchy, and he says, and Roosevelt is the cause of it, not the monarchy of the rich and powerful. Of course, to him that sort of meant the same thing. But so it was not only finding and repeating words, but it was also synthesizing them into a way that appeals to us in this time. So,
Steve, can I piggyback on that? I don't know if anybody reread the foreword that Hal wrote for this book.
I have read it, but
Mark
not
Twain
recently.
and First of all, the foreword written by Hal Holbrook is worth the price of the book. Second of all, the book is amazing, and all the proceeds go to support the 4 Twain entities that you see on that turquoise bar. I reread this today, and I'm shocked from the events of the past few months. It's as though Hal was seeing into the future. If you want to see a condensed, I can't wait for Shelley's book. Oh, I can't wait for Shelley's book. If you want to see a condensed version of Hal's relationship with Mark Twain and the span of those years and the effect it had on Hal, read his foreword in Mark Twain and Youth, edited by Kent Rasmussen and Kevin MacDonald, our mutual friends. But wow, I read it and I just couldn't believe when I read it the first time. It's shocking how he saw the future. Shocking. That's all I'll say.
Now, was he an easy man to? And none of us lived with him, but do you think he was? I don't know. Strong is so strong-minded, so well spoken, but also tough.
He was such a truth teller. We made a little a documentary short back a couple years ago, and it hasn't been released publicly, but we filmed Hal and just a few things. But the main point of it from Hal was truth telling. And I think as long as you're truth telling with Hal, even if you're wrong, he's going to respect you for telling what you believe to be the truth. That was to me, that was my takeaway on Hal. He just wanted the truth. Don't sugarcoat.
I think Hal was hard on himself. I think Hal was, when you say was he hard to live with, I think that if you watch that documentary, Hal's very self-critical. And that's something he kind of shared with Twain. He took a lot on himself. Sometimes when, there were, you could take the easy way out and say, this was going on and I had to, Hal was very tough on himself, I think. He grew up in such awful circumstances. His mother left and deserted when he was very, very small. He never really knew his mother. His father had mental problems, and then he was sent to live with the grandfather, and they went to that awful Dickensian school where he was beaten regularly. And he has said this in other places, but he did say this to me at one point where we were talking about how he couldn't ever remember being hugged as a young man. Right. That he went through he could never remember being embraced, which was really funny because if you knew Hal in the time we knew him, the first thing he did was throw his arms around you. Hal was a big hugger. Yeah. When he noticed you, it was that bear hug that came out. And the older he got and the more he got over that sense of abandonment, I'm sure went through a lot of his life. And I think a lot of that early stuff, it probably drove him on stage. It probably drove him as an actor. But if he really, I found him to be very, like I said, self-critical. If he was tough, he was no tougher on himself than he was anybody else. And I always thought that, and I've always kind of sometimes just wanted to yell at him. It's as you sometimes want to yell at Twain, as you see Twain always trying to claim something that he was guilty of in his writing. And sometimes you just want to go, oh, give yourself a break, would you? Would you please let up on yourself? Because, he was, there was an incredible sweetness to Hal. And I just, like I said, the many, many years we had, and I don't want to make this too somber because Hal had one of the great laughs of all time. Hal had a laugh that could knock you back 4 feet when he thought something was funny, and he had a laugh, and just bam, it would just shoot you right back. And he was just, like I said, there was a warmth and a genuineness, and I think he said this. I think Dixie Carter had a lot to do with it. I think Dixie brought him out. Dixie's family was very warm, and they were all huggers. And I think, when he married Dixie, Dixie sort of gave him permission. And I know Cindy and Shelley are going to say this, and I don't want to say this because it's hard to say this without tearing up a little bit. But Hal never got off the phone without saying, I love you. It's pretty powerful. That's usually reserved for relations and your children and your parents, and but Hal wanted you to know it. So when you would end up a conversation, you'd say, I love you. And if that don't ring home, if that don't go right to your heart, I don't know what will.
When he was in Hannibal and we presented him with a Mark Twain Lifetime Achievement Award, he gave the most beautiful talk, and he talked about Dixie. Mark, what you just said, he said that Dixie gave him her family and they welcomed him and loved him, and it really changed him. And he told such sweet stories about her that day, and I'll never forget him talking about one day they were working together early on when they were first getting together. They were working on this project together, and I don't know where he got it or why he had it, but he had a lasso and he lassoed her from across the parking lot. And I just love that because it wasn't, too long after she had passed away, just 2 years. And he just loved her so. And when he came to Hannibal, I remember we got him sorted. Oh my gosh, the first time in 2010, of course, it was about a month after Dixie had passed. And he got in late. He wanted to go pick up some groceries. And I tell you, if you want to see something fun, you see Hal Holbrook late at night in a Walmart with those long legs of him striding along. I had to kind of run to keep up with him. And all the stock clerks were there, sort of jaw dropped and pointing, is that him? Is that him? And he's picking up some goodies to take back to the hotel. And it was just so precious watching. He was just so in charge, and we're going, and we got back to the hotel and wanted to make sure everything was just so. And I'll never forget when he opened up his suitcase. First of all, it looked like a movie prop. It was the most perfectly packed, neatest, tidiest suitcase I'd ever seen. And I don't know if Joyce packed it for him or if he packed it. I know that he did his makeup case, and he was he was a very organized person. But what he took out of the top of that and set on the little desk there was a framed photo of Dixie. And then to hear him talk about her like that, that love from her really, I don't know what he was like before that, but he sure gave her a lot of credit for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I can't say too much about, the film really captures so much of this. It's a beautifully made film. And you really, even if you aren't as lucky as these three and have had time to spend with Hal Holbrook, this will make you feel as though you are as intimately involved. A lot about his family that I think the filmmaker wasn't that sure would go over, and he go over with him when he showed it to him. He accepted it all. He thought it was great work himself. The film, of course, was made several years, 2 or 3 years ago. I think probably we have people in the audience, certainly at least 13, who want to join into the conversation. So I might call Jennifer LaRue back into the, she has back. I'll introduce you. Here she is. Jennifer LaRue, the events manager at the Mark Twain House, all ready to tell us what people are asking.
We have some excellent questions from the audience as usual, but before I pose them, I just want to say what a privilege to spend this time with you folks this evening. First of all, to talk to people who had the experience of knowing Hal Holbrook intimately and personally, and that's just been so lovely to have that shared with us this evening. And also, you're all just so freaking smart and know your Mark Twain so well. It's a delight. So thank you for sharing this evening with us. Yes, we do have a lot of really good questions, and I'm going to kind of condense 3 or 4 of them have to do with Hal Holbrook's research process and what kind of sources he turned to and people that he spoke to. You know, did he speak to Mrs. Lyons, his Mark Twain's secretary, Mrs. Lyon, I should say, late in life? And can you any of you address what you know about his research process and his sources?
Well, I'll just say that one of my great pleasures the last couple of years has been going through his library, going through his books and looking at what he wrote in the margins. And he got the Family Mark Twain, 4-volume Family Mark Twain in 1954, and immediately started writing stuff in the margins and underlining. And, he ran out of ways of emphasizing how excited he was. He had asterisks and checks and underlines and vertical marks, and sometimes all 3 out of passage. And he really was responding viscerally to what he was reading. The first Twain book he got in 1950 in Hannibal. He was passing through Hannibal years before he ever thought of doing Twain. He was touring, doing his 2-person show with his wife, and he went through Hannibal and he picked up Carolyn Harnsberger's Mark Twain at Your Fingertips, which was a great book for him to have picked up because that had quotes from the whole array of Twain's published work, and it was really a wonderful sort of introduction to different possibilities. But I found that he would often return to the same passages to rework them in different ways, in different numbers, as he called numbers, the pieces that he did, according to what was happening in the world. And so he was probably the best editor that Twain ever could have. Twain often needed a good editor. Hal was that editor. And he would often take bits and pieces from a dozen different sources and weave them into one text. But in his notes, he would often have the equivalent of footnotes, or parenthetical indications of where he got them from in case he wanted to go back and get more. So he was really meticulous about finding what he needed, putting it together, noting where he got it, and filing it away for future use, even if you couldn't use it right then.
Oh, thank you, Shelley.
And don't forget, he did call on Clara Clemens herself. And that had to be quite an informative exchange. He loved to tell that story and told it often, but what the takeaway had to have been for her to be giving Hal her blessing on performing as her father.
Well, she did have a suggestion that he decided not to take.
That's right.
She told him he should do a one-man show of Jesus Christ.
he thought that was a little over the line.
Right. But I should say that
Cindy, can you tell us more about that encounter, that conversation with Clara? Do you know?
Everybody knows this. This is sort of it's not just apocryphal. This is just one of the stories that Hal loved to talk about. Was when he called on her. She was living in a hotel, and her second husband answered the door, and he told Jacques that he said, she talks to him about you. So meeting her father, and he described walking into the room where she was in the bedroom. She was on the bed, surrounded by books and papers, just like Sam Clemens would be there in Hartford in the Angel Bed or wherever he was living at the time, always surrounded by his work. And he said that she had this shock of white hair, and if only she had the mustache, because she looked very much like her father. If only she had the mustache, he would have thought it was Sam Clemens himself there. But it was a nice, friendly exchange, and he was very early in his career performing Mark Twain, but that had to be quite an event for him. He told it often.
I should add too that he spoke with one person who wasn't a generally famous person, but who knew Mark Twain. He spoke with a musician, a pianist named Madame Charbonnel, who he met in Providence, Rhode Island, when he was doing a show. And she said she knew Twain in Vienna. She studied with the same music teacher who taught Clara. And she said, don't forget the serious side of him. Wow. And no one had ever told him that. This is in 1954, before he actually has performed a Twain show at all. Wow. And that made an impact on him, because it hadn't occurred to him that there was a serious side. He just knew Twain as the guy who wrote Encounter with an Interviewer, and didn't realize that there was a side of him that wasn't purely comic. So talking to people who knew Twain did make a difference.
And of course, Bim Pond encouraged him to go out and take it on the road. Bim Pond's father was the fellow who promoted Mark Twain's lecture tour, Following the Equator, those around the world lecture tours. So yeah, Hal was old enough. I mean, he's lived long enough to have had contact with some really important people, 1 degree of separation basically from Mark Twain.
Yeah, and that's, we're kind of talking around something which was also incredibly important as far as Hal's accomplishments goes, is that Hal did put together his portrayal of Mark Twain in the 1950s, and Twain died in 1910, which means there were a lot of people who were around who had known Twain or had encountered Twain. There's a famous story of somebody going to see his show in the late 1950s. And after the show, this guy had seen Mark Twain perform on the platform. Wow. And somebody asked this guy, what did you think? He said, I saw the son of a bitch the first time he came around. It's the same guy. So, this is, he was constantly encountering people. And what's important about that is, we know this, and a lot of people watching this know this, but the general public, this always comes as a surprise that there are no known recordings of Mark Twain's voice. He made them, but they're all lost. And it's kind of amazing that we don't. We have recordings of almost everybody else around Mark Twain. We have Theodore Roosevelt. We have Booker T. Washington. We have everybody who was around him. And yet, there is no authenticated recording of Twain's voice. So here comes Hal Holbrook putting together his characterization and doing the research and learning, not just from the books, but also from people, what the voice must have sounded like, what the cadences were like. And so if we have any knowledge or thought that we know, I always love people, because you encounter other people who play Mark Twain. And they say, well, how'd you put together your characterization? Well, I studied. Like, really? What did you study? How did you do this? Exactly. What did you exactly? Because the first thing I'm going to tell you is I went to school on Hal Holbrook. We all went to school on Hal Holbrook. Hal showed the way how to do it. There is no other way to know it. There's only a few seconds of film at the end at Stormfield, and there are no recordings of his voice. So this is why, for all the other reasons we've talked about, Hal Holbrook was a living piece of Mark Twain scholarship. And that's why that research is so important.
And he went through every account he could find of every lecture Twain had given. He read the book about Twain and Cable's joint lecture tour and underlined things constantly and wrote things in the margin. Every time somebody characterized what his voice sounded like, he took notes.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, can you talk about his neighbor, Mark Twain's neighbor, William Gillette, and I believe there's a recording that he had made of his impersonation of Mark Twain, and Hal Holbrook's relationship to that?
For a while, people actually thought that was Twain. That actually got modeled as an actual recording of William Gillette, who, as a young man, had known Twain, encouraged him to be an actor. And then he became the leading interpreter of Sherlock Holmes and became quite wealthy doing that, built himself quite a castle on the Hartford River and downriver from Hartford a bit. And Hal listened to it because he listened to it as an actor, but you can hear sign of the cultured Gillette tones coming in that. He probably got a little bit of Twain's voice from that Gillette recording, but he knew it wasn't Twain, even though it had been passed off by that. But it is important because here is an actor impersonating a person he knew and a neighbor. So it is important that he did have access to it.
Thank you. So we've kind of talked about, Mark Twain's scholarship, but Peter Roos, our executive director, says, can one or more of you speak to what impact you feel Hal had on keeping the relevance of Twain alive in the popular consciousness? So not just in a scholarly or academic sense, but in the popular conscience.
Well, wherever he performed, he did interviews beforehand. And in those interviews, he would bring up things that Twain would say about what was going on in the world. So he would give little snippets, almost sort of previews of what people would be getting in the show. Not exactly, he didn't really want to give away too much of what would be in the show. But he is constantly talking about current events through Twain in the popular press. And of course, the press then amplifies what he does in his show by choosing quotes from what he performs of Twain and bringing those to bear on current issues. So I think he had an enormous impact on making people aware of Twain in a very broad public sphere.
I think, Mark, you've written about the severe shortage. Of course, Hal commented on it too. Hollywood has not done Mark Twain justice. So most popular culture we take from television and Hollywood. And Hal gave this stunning, brilliant live performance thousands of times to large audiences, and kept the relevancy not just intact, but excited people to go out and find more Twain, to read more Twain. But there is such a shortage of something. My daughter and I have been working on a screenplay about Mark Twain, and it's a hard thing to wrestle because what do you write about? But Hollywood has never done anything real with that dark side of Mark Twain. We have that light version with Frederick March, and that's it. And then of course all the Hucks and Toms out there that they just haven't done justice to his real legacy. Hal's the only one that really went out there and would give you the humor that you were expecting, but then give you the sermon that you maybe didn't sign up for. So it's immeasurable what he did for the legacy.
Yeah, he also solidified our view of Mark Twain as the guy in the white suit. Now, there's no getting around it. Hal always played, this was the genius of the performance, that from 1954 on, he was playing Mark Twain at 70, which means he could have played it as a young man, and he could play it going into his 90s, and it really didn't make any difference. The look was the same. But it did solidify, in the pop culture, that when we do think of Mark Twain, because Americans love branding. We love to, get our mind wrapped around a label. So Mark Twain in the label is always the guy in the white suit. He wasn't that for a good part of his life. But the show was so powerful. We think of Mark Twain as the guy in the white suit, white hair, smoking a cigar on stage and throwing off witticisms. Mark Twain would have never smoked a cigar on stage. He would have, and when he appeared in front of the public, he wore evening clothes. He would have never worn a white suit in front of an audience, and he would have certainly never smoked. There were ladies present. Number one, you didn't do that, and number two, theaters were fire traps back then. Most theaters burned to the ground. They were very careful about that sort of thing. So, Twain as he presented Twain, was how we picture Twain as the end of his life. And that has solidified this kind of vision of Twain. That's not good or bad. It's just the truth, is that in the pop culture standpoint, if you say to somebody, Mark Twain, their image of Twain is going to be the guy with the white hair, the cigar, and the white suit. And that helps a lot. It helps keep Twain alive. It also hurts because it keeps us from seeing other dimensions of Twain that were there as well.
Even Scott Teems acknowledged before he got took Dixie's advice to make the documentary, he just thought that the Holbrook, the Mark Twain Tonight was something like a Las Vegas show, a bunch of one-liners. I mean, until he saw it, then he was gobsmacked, as Steve would say, because he had also bought into that persona. But yeah, Hal's legacy of Mark Twain is he kept him alive for the popular culture. Back in 2010, the 100th anniversary of Twain's death, the Smithsonian published a list of the most influential people on the last 100 years. And under the category of pop culture, Mark Twain led the list. Hal Holbrook had a big part in that, I would say.
We said that, how much he worked on getting the voice right. And in doing that, he gave Mark Twain a voice.
Yeah.
A voice which Herman Melville does not have. A voice which Nathaniel Hawthorne does not have. He has a voice that we can hear. Mark Twain's voice echoes through the 20th century and rolls on into the 21st century because Hal Holbrook gave him a voice. We don't really know what Mark Twain sounded like, but Hal gave him a voice that we accept as the actual voice of Mark Twain, and that voice we listen to. And it's important that we listen to it. So from that pop culture standpoint, again, it's immeasurable. Putting that into some kind of perspective would just blow the top of your head off. That's why we have somebody like Shelley to write a book about.
That's right. Thank you, Shelley.
And I can't resist adding that another way that he sort of kept Mark Twain's heritage alive. 3 months after he appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show, which was sort of his great breakthrough, he spoke at a fundraiser for the Mark Twain Memorial in Hartford, which was the sort of odd name they gave to the effort to restore the Mark Twain House, which at that point was just finishing up being a library and various other things. And ever from that point, that May 18th, I think, of 1956, right up through when Cindy brought him in for the 90th birthday, he's been a constant friend and help at the Mark Twain House, which he says, and I quote, in Mark Twain's house, its design inspired in places by his own mischievous vision, the memories of its former great tenant and his family seem to whisper there in the rooms and on the porches. And you can see those porches again now. So I'll stop there.
I should also just add that he was a good supporter of the Mark Twain Project and the Mark Twain Papers, and would have a note in his program encouraging people to support them, recognizing that that ongoing Twain scholarship is important to keeping Twain alive, and it certainly is.
And the other two institutions that we're talking about too, of course, the Boyhood Home and the Center for Mark Twain Studies.
And Hal was active at all of them. He would attend the conferences in Elmira when he could, and of course was very supportive, as Shelley said, of the project. I mean, every single program had that imprinted with the mailing address. Feel free to mail a donation to support this Twain scholarship. So yeah, he had a big, generous heart. He helped everybody.
He certainly did. When I was doing the paper on Hal for the 2009 Elmira conference, and I interviewed a lot of Twain scholars, including Shelley, about his accomplishments. And a lot of people talked about Hal as an actor. A lot of people talked about Hal as a Twain scholar. But Kent Rasmussen came up with a great description. He said he thought of Hal first and foremost as a missionary.
Oh.
Considering what Twain thought about missionaries, I thought that was an interesting selection. But he said, I really see him as a missionary for Mark Twain. He's out there spreading the word, winning converts over. And after every show, you think to yourself, another soul saved, another person from Mark Twain. And that was a great description of him. We can talk all night about his accomplishments as a Twain scholar and as an actor, but you also have to, as his support of all of these key Twain places show, he was also an incredible missionary.
Well,
that sounds like Kent. That was a good.
So Jennifer, do we have more questions? Or
there are a couple more. Do we have another minute or so? That are y'all willing to?
Oh, I think. Are you kidding?
Oh, nice.
I'm not watching.
You're gonna have to turn the lights out on us. Yeah.
Okay. Well, Ted Whittemore, who's one of our trustees, and a number of other people have upvoted, wanted to hear an answer to this question about some. Mark Twain traveled the world doing his on the lecture circuit. Did Hal do the same? Did he perform his Mark Twain Tonight outside the United States, and how was he received outside of the United States?
Yeah, well, he had two. He had two tours. One in 1960. I forget when the second one was, but he traveled all over Europe. He also traveled to India, and he had some really really positive responses to the material. He particularly performing The Silent Lie. When the Berlin Wall was still standing, he found that was the only place up to that point, besides Oxford, Mississippi, where there was first a dead silence and then somebody clapping. It was, he really found that people responded very well to Twain around the world. It sometimes was difficult. He hated simultaneous translators. He really didn't like to have to, or that's how the sequential, I mean, he really didn't like to be translated. And so if the hosts thought that a translation was required, he was unhappy. Most of the time he found that people could handle the English. But he had a very, very positive response wherever he traveled. And he was the first actor to be sent on tour by the State Department. When he went out in 1960, they had never sent a dramatic performance on tour to represent the United States. So he was the first.
Wow.
And I think
Cindy,
it was in 85.
in your head.
Shelley, was it 85 that he went around the world?
Yeah, 85 was the second trip. That was around the world, yeah. Although he never got to
that question. You were nodding your head as if you had a response. Do you have something you'd like to add to what Shelley has said?
Are you asking me?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. No. I can't wait for Shelley's book.
I know.
I have a lot of work to do still.
Get writing.
Well, and speaking of books, Susan Bailey says that he, I assume meaning Hal, told me he had written more than 400 pages on his second book. Will that book ever be published? Can you talk about that at all?
Yeah, we hope so.
I know he originally wrote the memoir as one volume. And I know Shelley read it, the first draft, and so did I. He sent it to us for feedback, and he originally had written it when then his publisher said, "Well, there's too much. There's too much here. You're going to have to cut this down." And then the discussion came, why not just break it into 2 volumes instead of editing all this wonderful stuff out? Why don't you just do it? And I remember having lunch with him in Beverly Hills and him saying, is that a good idea? Can you do that? And I said, well, Horton Foote did it in 3 volumes. Why not? You can do this any way you want. But the second volume never got finalized and never done, but there is a manuscript. And of course, all 3 of us would dearly love to see that see print someday. Because it covers the first volume ends with the opening of Mark Twain Tonight in 1959 in New York. There's an awful lot of life and an awful lot of Mark Twain left to tell. I suspect that if it were done as a second volume, it would need an editor, somebody like Shelley, who could step in and do a lot of editorial footnoting on it to give it some context and presentation. But I certainly think it would be incredibly valuable to see that see print.
I think we should start a groundswell movement for getting that.
And Shelley might know more about that than I do.
No, actually, I don't. I mean, I think that he was really hoping that he would finish it and that he would be able to publish it. And I think he was frustrated that he wasn't able to finish it or publish it. And so I don't know what the status of it is right now. But I like Mark, I really hope that it does see the light of day.
Mm-hmm.
I think we all do. Well, I think that is the majority of the questions that we received from our wonderful audience. And we always hear from speakers who come and talk in our auditorium that our audiences ask the best questions. And tonight has been no exception. So thank you, audience, for sharing your good thoughts with us. And my goodness, thank you all 4 of you for a delightful evening. I think that Hal Holbrook, who I never got the pleasure of meeting personally, would be really touched and honored. by your interest and your support of his legacy and your friendship. And I'm just so glad to see so many people here tonight sharing in that. So thank you. And Steve, thank you for doing a wonderful job of moderating, as always.
Oh,
And
thank you.
The DVD that we've talked about so much that we screened last week, I put a link in the chat and I'll add it again. If you are interested in purchasing this through the Mark Twain store, know that your purchase does benefit the Mark Twain House and Museum. And your donations tonight are shared equally among the institutions that Cindy mentioned at the beginning and are listed in that big green box at the bottom of your screen.
I feel like
thank you, and thank you to the three of you.
Thank you all for having
Listen, thanks for letting us come and talk about Hal. I'll add one thing before we go, which is you said that Hal would be touched and pleased. Hal would have been embarrassed and would have wanted us to shut up a long time ago. If he had been here listening to this, he would have been squirming a long time ago under. I want to. I don't, not to extend this, but I want to add one thing because we talked about Hal's great charm. There's a quote that Mark Twain had about youth, and he once said that I'm old. I recognize it, but I don't realize it. That quote summarizes Hal Holbrook in so many ways to me. That there was a youth to Hal, as there was a youth to Twain, his wife's nickname for him. And Hal's energy, well into his 80s, was a remarkable thing. I remember, hearing that he had fallen and fractured his hip. And he was going to an escalator. I think it was at an airport, but he turned rapidly and he fell. He was in his mid-80s at the time. And, for somebody in their mid-80s, sometimes that's the beginning of the end. You worry about that. And I immediately got in touch with Joyce, who basically laughed off my concerns and said, "You don't think something like a fractured hip's going to slow him down, do you?" And a few weeks later, he was standing on stage with help of a brace, doing the whole show standing for 2 hours. That was Hal Holbrook.
I wanted to thank you also for pulling us all together and giving us the chance to share these thoughts. And it's really a treat to be with Mark and Cindy, both of whom I really admire. And I just wanted to say that if Hal had known about this, he would have been not just embarrassed, as Mark said, but he would have been surprised, because he was so modest and so sweet that I don't think he was really aware of how important he was to the world and to us, that he was just so devoted to what he was doing that he never really looked at what it meant to the rest of us. But it certainly meant the world to me.
I want to add a funny little story that is so Hal, and it really sums up what Shelley just said about him. My niece and I were in Washington, D.C. and had dinner with him and Joyce Cohen, his wonderful assistant, and just the best person in the world for taking care of Hal. And Joyce, if you're listening, thank you for all you've done for Hal. We were at the Occidental, just the four of us having a nice little quiet dinner. And Shelley, we saw you the next night because it was for the AFI documentary. So you were there for that. And there at dinner, people kept trying to buy Hal drinks. They recognized him immediately, and they kept trying to buy him drinks. And Mark, he would give that big laugh the way you can do it. I can't do it. I'll sound silly, but he would give that big laugh, and he would say, "I don't even drink." Of course, everybody wanted to buy him a drink. But if you've ever been in the Occidental, you'll know it's famous for its portraits all around of famous people who have dined there and have signed a photo, and they're hanging on the wall. And at some point in the evening, the manager came out and asked Hal, would you send us a signed photo that we could put up here? And Hal said, of course. Tell us what you need, what do we need to do? And he said, okay. He said, at the Occidental, placement is strategic, and it's very thought out about where to put people and how they, who they're next to and this and that. So he asked Hal, he said, now I have two options. We can put your portrait next to Steven Spielberg. And of course, Hal had just made Lincoln prior to that, and played Preston Blair. And he said, or we could put you next to G. Gordon Liddy. And of course, that's the nod to his role in All the President's Men, Watergate, Deep Throat, all that. And Hal just snorted. He was delighted with the choices, and he didn't hesitate a second. He said, Spielberg. So I'm eager to go back to the Occidental and find Hal's portrait up there next to Steven Spielberg's. But he was delighted by that. He didn't want anybody buying him a drink, but he loved the idea of having his portrait there.
Oh, what a great story. Thank you for sharing that. Oh, and while I'm saying thank yous, you all have been so gracious. And I do also want to acknowledge my colleague, Mallory Howard, whose idea this was really, and who really worked tirelessly to pull this and last week's programs together. So Mallory, I think you're in the audience tonight. Thank you from all of us. And thank you to the audience, and thank you to the four of you for just a delightful evening. I think we'll all remember it for a really long time. And don't be strangers. Please come visit us as soon as it's safe to do so. We'd love to have you back.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.